Hi guys, I'm Zaakir. I debated for Elizabeth Moy School at the Sri Lankan School Circuit. I debate for University College London at the university level circuit. I'm currently head coach of CIS as well. Today I'll be discussing one of the motions set at Viji's, which reads, "This House supports the revival of Christianity in the West." Just a quick note, the document I'm sharing right now is linked in the description. It has all my prop and op arguments, including mechanisms. The reason for why is because I don't think I'll be able to go through the individual mechanisms just because of time constraints. So in the instances when you find a specific claim that you're struggling to mechanize, perhaps either pause the video and go through it or go through it after this video is over. This house supports motion as well, by the way, which means that we're not arguing about whether the revival of Christianity is something that is likely to happen or not. It's a question about whether this is something we support or opposes, insofar as we're either pro it happening or against it. On proposition, then, the first point of framing should always be what it is we're supporting and what it is we are opposing on the other side. So what does this revival look like? There are two reasons for this. The first is that the manual highly encourages it. The second is that it obviously sets forward the debate and allows your argumentation to really seep in and allow it to stand, particularly because sometimes when you get to third speech, you end up realizing the core disagreement in the round isn't about whether or not this is explicitly good or explicitly bad, because at different scopes of revival, you might have positive argumentation and negative argumentation, which can both stand. So, like, understanding the scope of this revival is probably a good thing. Two things to note on this revival. The first is that the rate is likely to be somewhat slow and gradual. I don't think it's going to be driven singularly by like one large event. The reason for why is it's just far too hard for debaters to be able to analyze what this single event that drives massive revival and allows so many people to opt into Christianity is. So it's likely to be a host of factors, somewhat slow and gradual. The second is that obviously the scope of the revival isn't going to be such that everyone buys in, but it's going to be one in which a significant proportion of people right now who need religion are able to access it and then find meaning from it. Second, I think in any debate where you're defending massive opt-in into religion, it's important to note reasons as to why religion is also likely to become more liberal, more inclusive, less coercive, and all of this. I have six reasons in the doc. The first four analyze top-down mechanisms as to why the institution has incentives to want to become liberal. The reason for why is because they want to appeal to a younger base and whatnot. The bottom two are mechanisms as to why people interpret religion in a way that's more progressive and more inclusive. I will note that teams generally do end up finding the first four mechanisms, but somewhat miss the bottom two. The reason for why is because I feel like we've grown accustomed to the analysis that the institution becomes more liberal because the Pope has now accepted gay people or whatnot. But oftentimes there are alternate incentives for why the institutions of religion don't want to become liberal. They want to still maintain favor with older conservatives who have higher social and economic capital insofar as they donate more, which means you often don't want to like um appeal to or you don't want to like give credence to fears that religion is now being um, plagued by modern day liberalism and whatnot. Um, the bottom two mechanisms go as follows. One, the construct of religion has changed from an institutional authority from the way it was in the past to now something that is extremely spiritual and personal to people, which means that the force of religious institutions um, within the lives of individual followers have massively reduced. The second is that the internet and social media have obviously increased access to more theological interpretations and perspectives within Christianity, which means people are exposed to more progressive factions and liberal voices within the space. So they opt into these interpretations, given that they don't want to have that internal strife between what they want to do and the religion that they end up following. Um, I would note the bottom two mechanisms are stronger because it's independent of whether or not the church now interprets scripture or interprets verses in a way that's more progressive. It's just people take it on in a more progressive way. Two arguments then on proposition. The first is on why this grants meaning to people's lives. The second is on economic redistribution. On granting meaning to people's lives, the first question you should always ask yourself is, why is this not existing in the status quo? Like, why is it so hard for people right now to seek out meaning within their lives? There are four reasons I've given here. The first is that Western culture pushes you into being individualistic. The second is that there's consumerist advertising and social media, which tell you that happiness and fulfillment is achieved through material possessions. The third, I guess that's the third mechanism. The second mechanism is that there are You live in a capitalist system where there is competitive jobs and narratives like hustle culture, which push you into overworking yourself and doesn't ground you. The third was consumers advertising. The fourth is that you often seek out scientific explanations for meanings like or scientific explanations for questions like what's the purpose of my existence or what happens after we die. And these questions are or these answers are generally quite reductionist and leave us with this epistemic uncertainty because like the fact that there's nothing that happens after we die obviously brings into question the impermanence of our own existence and what it is we're actually doing within our day-to-day lives. Yeah. The importance of this material is that even if you're unable to prove that this revival is so massive to the point where everyone who lacks meaning buys into religion, it is often true that those who opt into religion are the ones who do lack meaning, and this is significant as a result of those four mechanisms. Why is it that the people who seek meaning are the ones who opt into religion? Generally speaking, it is still a choice to want to opt in, which means that in the instances when you're relatively comfortable outside of this revival, also outside of this religion, you likely don't feel the pull to opt in, given there are likely push factors which led to you growing agnostic or growing atheistic in the first place. The third burden then is on why religion is uniquely meaningful and fulfilling to people. I note the word uniquely here because there are obviously other ways in which people can access meaning and fulfillment. Why does religion uniquely fill a hole in people that anything like nothing else can? The first is because it's comforting to know that you exist for a higher purpose, that you aren't just a human walking their lives away on this planet in the middle of nowhere. The second is that people obviously go through highs and lows. In the instances when you go through those low moments, the belief that you will one day be saved through eternal salvation is the reason for why people get past those times. The third is that, like, insofar as you go to the church, you likely experience the community that the church gives you, which you otherwise wouldn't be able to get with the relationships that you have within your day-to-day interactions because they tend to be relatively shallow, because people just one deprioritize them, but two because they simply don't find purpose in fulfilling, or rather find purpose in um, currying those relationships. On the comparative, priests often spread narratives which tell people they ought care about the community that they're a part of, that they ought build relationships and whatnot. The fourth is that religion is the highest moral framework that you can buy into and directly contradicts any capitalist and any consumerist narrative that you might consume. Because what's higher than God and what's higher than eternal salvation or eternal damnation? Which means that you allow people to question whether getting that promotion that they really want, that new apartment or that car, which would cost them massively on like a personal level, is genuinely worth it. Which means people are more critical now, and this allows them to be able to access fulfillment through other mechanisms like um all the problems that we noted over here because people just don't buy into them to the same level. The way you ground this claim within the debate is by first pointing out that this is prerequisite to everything else, insofar as the moral framework that you buy into, but also the like the general life philosophy that you buy into, likely sets forward one, the goals that you want to pursue within your life, two, how secure you feel within your day-to-day interactions, and three, just generally how you respond to things as well. The second way you preemptively weigh this is by just noting down that a lot of the people we are talking about in this debate are people who are extremely vulnerable and would likely engage in more destructive behavior on the comparative just because they can't access meaning in any other way as a result of our third burden. So we should probably care about these people. Cool. Second argument then on economic redistribution. The first burden is obviously pointing out why economic redistribution is necessary. The way you do this is by pointing at Western countries and their um, asymmetry in wealth as a result of like high levels of unchecked capitalism and whatnot, which means that there are vulnerable populations who can't afford things like basic necessities and rely upon the church in order for them to be able to do this. We simply expand the services that the church provides, but also to like the number of people it's capable of providing it to. First burden. Why do people simply donate more on our side of the house? There are five reasons here. General gist of it is that religion one encourages you, otherwise it coerces you through things like or not coerces, but rather it places an obligation upon you to do it. The third is that even if there are like highly selfish people, religion gives them a personal incentive to want to donate. The fourth is that there's an environment of donation within religion, insofar as you see other people put money into the church basket or church box, and hence you feel an obligation to do it, but also like you're motivated to do it. The fifth is that oftentimes the reasons why people don't donate, especially from highly privileged positions, is because they have massive cognitive dissonance on those issues. The priest explicitly talks about issues that happen within the day-to-day life. I guess what happens, the vulnerabilities of people is a better way to put it. The priest explicitly talks about the vulnerabilities of people in order to make believers feel grateful for the position they are in within their life, which means that on net you can't have this cognitive dissonance. The second claim you can run is that even if you don't get more donations, we still think that the money that ends up being donated is better managed. And this is for two reasons. The first is because you have a centralized authority conducting all of these donations and conducting all of these charities, which means fixed cost decrease. You benefit from the stock analysis of economies of scale. The second is that insofar as the people who work for charities organized by the church are people who volunteer there as opposed to like people who get paid by NGOs and charities, it's likely that less money goes towards funding their salaries and more of it goes towards creating this meaningful change. Then you impact this and point out why this benefits the most vulnerable. One, in order to maintain social legitimacy and proselytize, churches obviously use this money to do things like have community outreach programs, they have food banks, they have shelters, they have educational centers for the most vulnerable and whatnot. As a result of this, the most vulnerable are able to access all of these benefits that they likely wouldn't on the comparative. Second part of this, I guess, recording is on the opposition speech, or like the opposition case rather. First on framing. Approaching this from op is, I think, a bit easier than it is approaching it from prop. That's just because the arguments flow a bit easier. And we also somewhat know what this looks like, given we have had Christian revivals in the past in the form of like the evangelical revival, or the Great Awakening as it's called as well. So on the way on framing, I guess at the top, you can point out there are likely multiple different reasons why people buy into Christianity as a revival. The first is that you obviously want meaning and purpose, like buy into propositions frame here. The second is that it's likely weaponized by right-wing um, political and social influences to suggest that the reason for why we have moral decay in society right now is because of um, our moving away from God. So gender identity and like gender orientation being extremely malleable are claims that a lot of people within the moderate, especially like center right moderate, are just a bit unfamiliar with and a bit uncomfortable with. Um, as a result of this, like conservative political voices are able to use it in a way that amplifies the narrative that this is a result of religion being less pivotal in people's lives, and therefore people focus on it a bit more. I think it's also like important to note that conservatism as a general political faction has become more amplified now than ever before, given recent trends towards conservatism after 2016 and Trump's election, basically. I think also note that this likely happens asymmetrically across the West, whereas certain communities, like states that were initially blue states, but are now like slowly shifting towards more red states, are the ones that likely become accustomed to this revival. I think that's a good way to put it. Um, and this is because of large scale messaging and proximity, because you might have churches within those areas which have massive political influence or certain influences within those areas as well. I think you obviously begin your opposition case by rebutting some of the claims that come out of proposition. The first is on religious charity. I think it's important to note that not all money ends up being donated to religious charity, because if you give money to the church, a significant proportion of it is used to do things like lobby local policymakers, hire more priests and pay their salaries, conduct church renovations and whatnot. The underlying delta then just becomes that less of this money ends up going to creating better change or creating tangible change, as opposed to like going towards benefiting the church's individual um, social and political incentives. The second point of rebuttal is that even if you don't buy the claim that religious charity is in itself, um, like, I guess less of this money ends up going to religious charity, you can just flip the premise that religious charity is in itself a good thing by pointing out it's harmful. There are four reasons for this. The first is that it's explicitly coercive. The second is that it's harmful insofar as people who try to help local communities don't understand what those particular communities need, and as a result have crises which occur. Not crises, but like you harm those local communities. There's an example somewhere there about where is it? Yeah, the provision of free clothing. The third is that religious charity generally comes with certain strings attached, like for instance, encouraging recipients of religious charity to work for the church as opposed to their local communities in general. Even if this isn't explicit, there is a coercive restriction because you feel an obligation to the church and therefore you likely go there. The fourth is like religious charities are generally harmful because you reduce government accountability at the local level because you depend upon the church and therefore don't expect policymakers to create policy that allows for this to happen from the state level. And I guess the impact of this is that it tries to largely symmetricize some of the positive push that we get from government bench about religious charity by just noting that you likely end up having the basic needs of the most vulnerable being met regardless. Maybe not to the same extent, but to some extent because you hold your local state um, or municipal government accountable rather. Two arguments then. The first is on how there's religious coercion and abuse. The second is on how this creates more uncertainty and less fulfillment within people's lives. The second argument is a direct flip of Proposition's first argument. So on religious coercion and abuse, the first claim you'd make is on why people buy into conservative conceptions of Christianity, because Proposition does give reasons at the top of their speech, at the top of their framing rather, as to why this is likely going to be liberal progressive interpretations. There are three reasons here. The first is that biblical texts are quite old and often quite outdated. The second is that there are senior elites within religious organizations who are themselves quite old and conservative. They generally train the next crop of religious officials as well, which means that there is a direct um, push of religion towards conservatism because they steer the religion there. The third is that even if there are new fringe churches and new theological interpretations that you're exposed to, you likely don't opt into them because one, they don't have the support socially, and they don't have that legitimacy that exists in order for them to be viable. The second is that you likely get ostracized from society and you get called out by mainstream Catholics and Protestants. And this somewhat also flips the second argument, like before we do it more strongly within this within our second argument as well. Sorry, it flips Proposition's first argument rather about how religion grants people certainty and fulfillment by just pointing out if you buy into a fringe uh, denomination of Christianity, it is likely that you feel uncertain because you're consistently called out about this by Protestants and Catholics who feel like um, this this is directly threatening their the legitimacy of their religion. Yeah. Okay. Then you give reasons as to why religion is coercive. There are 5 reasons here. I won't get time to go through all of them, but ideally pause the video and do so. Um, the general gist of it is that religion holds massive leverage over you because it holds the threat of eternal damnation, which is something people can't realistically weigh up because nothing in this life um, can ever come close to the amount of suffering that you would experience should you go to hell, or the amount of happiness you would experience should you go to heaven. So it's an extremely coercive structure. There are 4 other reasons there as well. Then you end up pointing at the social and political implications of this. The first is that your personal agency is restricted. I guess it's a personal implication, because of the potential consequences and the leveraging power that we pointed out previously. The second is that you often have less capacity to maximize your own materialist power because religious communities do things like force you to pay off religious obligations like tithes and whatnot. Um, this is particularly harmful for poor people because you sap away their wealth, you plague them with guilt when they're unable to meet their expected religious contributions and whatnot. The likely proposition response to this in either second or third is going to be that poor people don't have to pay tithes because it's like something that's only granted, or only something that's like expected for like middle class people. One, most poor people don't identify themselves as being poor, and religious leaders often have an incentive to want to spread this in a way that expects all poor people to also pay tithes because like they benefit from the social legitimacy of the church gaining more money and whatnot. Um, all right. The third mechanism is that Christian institutions generally tend to hold and propagate problematic views towards minorities, women, the queer community, and generally, oftentimes, all historically disenfranchised and marginalized groups. There are three reasons why this is true. So not three reasons. There are three implications of this. The first is that it's harder to get effective social change because the institution which now has more social power is able to lobby on individual politicians. The second is that the people who are raised within these newly religious communities are likely to now express outward hate, particularly given that we've granted characterization at the top of op as to why this happens in asymmetric ways. This likely suggests that new people, or rather children that are being exposed to religious communities, are indoctrinated in a way that makes them hate these oppressed minorities as well. The third is that oftentimes there are people within these religious groups who are also part of these minority groups, like queer communities growing up in Christian households. You repress your identity and you shame yourself for who you are on propositions comparative because of religious messaging, which tells you you're immoral and whatnot. There's a preemption at the end of this about why proposition might argue later on as well as to why this could happen on the could happen regardless, because these are center right individuals as per our framing. Otherwise, there are two reasons for why this is like amplified on um the comparative. The first is because you're more comfortable um demonizing uh you're more comfortable demonizing these values because there's a moral framework that religion pushes upon people and tells us this like socially acceptable and the right moral framework. The second is that the second is that you find yourself in communities of people who may have stronger views against this than you do. So echo chamber analysis, you now you're now more likely to hold stronger views against them because that's all you're exposed to. The second argument then is about how this creates more uncertainty and less fulfillment. I already pointed this out, but this directly flips the first argument about from proposition about how this grants meaning to people's lives. The first is on why you need this, I guess, why this reduces fulfillment explicitly. One, you obviously live in a capitalist society. You're consistently exposed to cultures of overworking and consumerism, which likely means you're conditioned into the idea of wanting that dream job, wanting that nice car, wanting that promotion. The question then just becomes whether you're happy seeking those things out to feel guilty about those personal urges. It's likely you feel guilty on their side of the house because the church tells you this isn't something you should do. Um, this is also more important given that government's direct framing points out why it is unlikely that religion is going to maintain such a pivotal role within people's individual lives. So it is likely going to be somewhat small. And therefore, you face this um, what's the word I'm looking for? You face this internal strife. Yeah. Second question is about why this invites uncertainty. So obviously, if you're someone who's atheistic or agnostic, you likely don't believe that there is much more outside of this world because you wouldn't worry about whether the religion you follow is the right one or the wrong one. On the comparative, buying into religion as a concept means you buy into a general higher purpose about your life. Um, like you buy into the concept that there is something like the afterlife and whatnot, which means that you consistently worry about whether one, you're doing this in a way that grants you that eternal salvation or condemns you to eternal damnation. But second, it's also the case that you question whether the denomination of Christianity that you're following is the right one, given there are obviously multiple different denominations. This is more so true, as I pointed out earlier, if you buy into a fringe church, because you consistently question this every single time people um, call you out for going to that church and whatnot. All right, cool. I think that brings us to the end of like the more intuitive arguments from proposition and opposition. The way this debate I would expect to like clash down later on is one on whether religious coercion and abuse is so significant. This is a framing clash rather than it is argumentation clash, because proposition's framing somewhat tries to mitigate opposition's first argument preemptively. The second is that opposition's second argument directly mitigates proposition's first argument about how religion grants, whether or not religion is explicitly fulfilling. Second and third speakers would have to weigh up the desire for meaning as opposed to uncertain meaning. I think it is provable on both sides of the house why this is like either true or not true. Like you can question whether or not people genuinely want meaning or whether they just want less stress, and symmetricizing um the negative push at the top of P1 by saying that people would likely have the stress regardless, as the analysis did, somewhat mitigates here. And then you can mitigate against the uncertainty claim by just suggesting that people have cognitive dissonance and believe that the religion that they follow is likely the one that's right. Because they find themselves in communities and echo chambers where they often don't talk about their religion, so they don't face this scrutiny from society and whatnot. On economic redistribution, I think this is in itself an individual clash, just because there is analysis over here to suggest as to why either less money goes towards creating change or religious charity is in itself harmful. Um, you can weigh out this by just talking about how the most vulnerable people are now likely to receive this um, charity. That's generally it, I think. Those three clashes are what I'd expect, especially from these two cases on proposition and opposition. Um, Obviously, second and third speakers might need to do a bit more of individual mechanistic weighing, but also like impact weighing, and point out why maybe some people having uncertainty in some very specific instances is justified if people who literally are on the verge are able to access the most pivotal forms of meaning. Obviously, be a bit charitable to the claims coming from the other side, because there is obviously two sides to the coin. The question then just becomes which side is um, more right, or which side can you convince the judge is more right. um that's generally it. All right, guys, that brings me on to like the end of this video as well. uh yeah, you guys can probably find the document in the description box below, if you want to go through it another time.